Barrett's rapid defection from reality into his private parallel universe of psychosis and delusion was rapidly becoming, however, an exasperation to his fellow band members. They were tiring of a situation where Syd was being hailed by outsiders as a wayward genius, while having themselves to deal with the destructive effects of his bizarre and disruptive behaviour on a day-to-day basis. Where Syd had been charming, playful and beguiling, he became arrogant and egotistic, often treating those around him with a sneering disdain. At gigs he took to standing on stage staring ahead of him, his arms at his sides, playing a single note through entire numbers or refusing to play at all. On Planet Syd, normal service seemed unlikely to be resumed anytime soon. On November the 18th, 1967, EMI released a third single, Apples and Oranges, another Barrett composition. It was backed with Rick Wright's Paint Box, which, although it came with many of the hallmarks of early Pink Floyd, lacked the essential magic of Syd's compositions. The single was a flop. It was clear that for this and other reasons something had to change. Waters, Wright and Mason decided to invite David Gilmour to join the band as a second guitarist and add much-needed stability. A suggestion was made that Syd should stay on as their principal songwriter, reflecting the situation between the Beach Boys and their own troubled genius, Brian Wilson. But with Syd's descent into his own private hell rapidly accelerating, more drastic measures were needed to save the band from a catastrophic decline.
The start of a very difficult and strange time, with both Syd and I turning up together to rehearsals and going out and doing shows with 5 of us, where I would be learning and playing Syd's parts and singing Syd's songs, while Syd would be sort of standing there and sometimes singing a little bit and sometimes playing a little bit.
A brief spell with Pink Floyd as a 5-piece band only served to highlight rather than address the problems. Finally, on their way to a gig at Southampton University in 1968, the band decided to leave Syd at home and go without him. The gig was a success. The problem was solved. Syd was no longer a member of Pink Floyd, and from that moment it would become a very different band. The split with Syd also precipitated the end of the band's working relationship with Peter Jenner and Andrew King, who felt that Syd was possessed of a unique talent, and if you subtracted that from the Pink Floyd formula, there was little left to celebrate. This was a view shared in ensuing years by many Pink Floyd purists who felt that the lumbering 1970s version of Pink Floyd was a mere shade of its former self. It could conjure none of the magic of the Syd years and displayed all the pomp, pretense and vacuity of such prog rock nightmares as Emerson, Lake and Palmer, with none of the musical virtuosity. If ELP were a rock band whose name seemed to belong to a firm of solicitors, Pink Floyd became the musical equivalent of a partnership of competent yet undistinguished architects. The structures they designed were conceptually mundane and hollow inside. The real tragedy of Syd Barrett's fall from grace is that if anyone around him realised what was happening to him, they seemed to lack the will or resources to do anything about it. Syd's disintegration continued to be, in part at least, a public as well as a private spectacle. The split from Pink Floyd came during sessions for their second album. 2 projected singles, Scream Thy Last Scream and Vegetable Man, were left unreleased and quickly became collector's items. The latter seemed to show that Syd knew what was happening to him while managing to retain his bizarre sense of humour. He also played on Remember a Day by Rick Wright and 2 compositions by Roger Waters, Seesaw and Set the Controls for the Heart of the Sun. But his parting shot, Jug Band Blues, the final track from A Saucerful of Secrets, the album which saw Syd fade from the Pink Floyd universe, demonstrated one last flash of genius. The song, which featured a Salvation Army brass band and Syd's only vocal on the album, made it known that he was gone, both from Pink Floyd and possibly for the time being from objective reality. Both would be the poorer without him. For Syd, part of the problem was that he really had nowhere else to go. The band had provided social, creative and financial security. Yet the music business is an industry and not a philanthropic or charitable institution. Syd had made it impossible for Pink Floyd to function with him, and he resented it continuing without him. Following Syd's departure, Pink Floyd's mystique and popularity, at least in Britain, seemed to grow in direct disproportion to their creativity. A Saucer Full of Secrets tried very hard to be a Pink Floyd album in the manner of its predecessor, but failed in several key respects, these largely concerning energy, vision and originality. It was followed by the sprawling, indulgent double album, Ummagumma, a record that seemed to exist for the very purpose of demonstrating the band's weaknesses while highlighting a few of their strengths. If Pink Floyd were not lost without Syd, they were certainly taking the long road back to any kind of creative vitality. Following Barrett's departure from Pink Floyd, Peter Jenner suggested he begin recording material for a solo album. With Jenner producing the songs, he embarked on a series of tentative attempts to record some new songs, but it was not long before Jenner admitted that he was at a loss to know how to deal with his protégé, and the project collapsed. Syd rented a flat in London and went back to his first love, painting. A year later, however, his mental state had improved sufficiently for him to approach Malcolm Jones, who was developing EMI's flagship progressive label Harvest, about the prospect of recording a solo album. With Jones as producer, work began on material for the Madcap Laughs. Sessions continued later in the year, with David Gilmour and Roger Waters producing the final tracks. The Madcap Laughs, Syd's first solo album, was released on Harvest at the end of January 1970. Its now infamous cover shows Syd in his flat in London, the floorboards painted purple and orange, with his girlfriend Iggy the Eskimo sitting naked on a wooden stool. Syd's eyes are hidden by hair that hangs over his eyes like a pastiche Beatles wig. It gives the eerie impression of someone who can peer out, yet whose gaze cannot be met.
We were recording a Radio 1 show, and Syd didn't turn up, and I think it was a Friday. And when they found Syd, which I think was a Sunday or Monday, they told us that, well, something's happened to Syd, and something had happened to him, total difference. He took too much, like he'd gone. He was still looking the same, but he was somewhere else.
Anyone approaching the Madcap Laughs expecting Piper at the Gates of Dawn Part 2 would have been bemused by the music inside the glossy gatefold sleeve. This was Syd stripped bare of artifice or guile. What remains is harrowing and, on several occasions, painfully honest. The listener enters into a voyeuristic pact with its producers, often to shocking effect. Many of the tracks were constructed by recording Syd solo and then adding session musicians, including humble pie drummer Jerry Shirley and members of British art rockers Soft Machine. It was clearly a challenging task for them to follow Syd's rambling song structures, and the effect is unsettling. The Madcap Laughs makes for distinctly uneasy listening. In June 1970, Barrett performed a one-off gig with Gilmour and Jerry Shirley. After 4 numbers, he laid down his guitar and walked off stage. Harvest must have been sufficiently satisfied with Madcap's sale performance, however, as, following the album's release, work began almost immediately on its successor. The result, Barrett, was released in November 1970. Though often cited as revealing an even more fractured mental state than Madcap, it is, superficially at least, a more focused and polished set of performances. Credit for this must be given in part to producers David Gilmour and Richard Wright. Despite problems with Syd's erratic and confused state, the 2 albums contain much of his best-loved work, and during the time between their release and his death in 2006, successive generations of writers and performers would turn to them for inspiration. To promote the release of Barrett, Syd recorded 2 radio sessions, the first for John Peel and the second a few months later for Bob Harris's Sounds of the 70s. He subsequently left his flat in London and returned to Cambridge. He became engaged to his new girlfriend, Gayla Pinion, then called off the engagement not long later, accusing Gayla of having illicit affairs, first with her former boyfriend and then with Jerry Shirley. In 1972, he embarked on his next assault on the sensibilities and expectations of those hungry still to witness some kind of redemption, a welcoming back to the fold of the former king of the Flower Children. This being Syd, however, the focus was inevitably on what could go wrong or what could fail to go right, rather than what could happily and easily go according to plan. Syd's genius for sabotaging his own success, despite or because of himself, had been honed to a fine art. Early in 1972, Twink, former Pretty Things and Pink Fairies drummer, performed at King's College, Cambridge with American guitarist Eddie Burns. They were joined on stage by Syd Barrett. In discussions that followed, it was decided that Syd, Twink and a local Cambridge musician called Jack Monk would form a band. They were to be called Stars. Following a few low-key gigs, they landed a spot at the Cambridge Corn Exchange, opening for American agit rock legends MC5. The billing was somewhat bizarre in its matching of the 2 disparate acts, but it went ahead nonetheless. In a later interview for the Syd Barrett fanzine Opal, Twink revealed that melody maker journalist Roy Hollingworth, a longtime Barrett fan, had written about the gig for the paper. What he said he had witnessed was an extraordinary performance by Syd that went out on its own trajectory somewhere only he knew, frequently leaving Twink and Jack Monk visibly at odds to know what to do. Hollingworth wrote that he thought Syd was wonderfully inspired, but that in real terms the Stars gig was a shambles, with a large proportion of the audience wandering off during their set. The day the review came out, Syd went round to Twink's house. He flatly refused to have anything more to do with the band. So that was that. According to Twink, various tapes exist of rehearsals and some of the gigs, captured either on cassette or recorded professionally. It was not clear what had subsequently happened to any of those tapes.
My friendship with him and his illness combined, provide an enormous opportunity for grief. It's sad. It's very sad. I'm still very sad about it,
Though their respective fortunes would remain subtly interwoven, in 1972 the contrast between Barrett and the group he'd been instrumental in establishing, which he had named, and for which he had written 2 hit singles and a groundbreaking album only 4 years previously, was astonishing. Syd was living in the basement of his mother's house, shut away underground apart from the world and its prying eyes, or living in his flat in London's Chelsea cloisters. Meanwhile, without him, Pink Floyd had become, one suspected, everything that Syd might have feared they would. They had followed 1970's Atom Heart Mother with a soundtrack for the Barbette Schroeder movie More, a collection of formal songs with instrumental mood pieces. In 1971 they released Medal, the album whose second side contained a sequence of loose fragments, artfully edited to form the epic 23-minute track Echoes. This extended song suite marked the start of their remarkable climb from cult phenomenon to mainstream superstardom. The process paused momentarily in 1972 with another soundtrack for Barbette Schroeder, Obscured by Clouds, and peaked in 1973 with their classic concept album Dark Side of the Moon. This was comprised of their most focused set of material to date. It combined to form Roger Waters' pessimistic but ultimately philanthropic treatise on the human condition, its weaknesses and associated suffering. From then on, Waters' work tended to groan under the weight of its own meaning. Syd's work, by contrast, though laden with poignancy, retained much of its humour and lightness of touch, as with Effervescent Elephant, Baby Lemonade or Gigolo Aunt, all from Barrett.